Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever, stared at a huge stack of research papers or articles, notes maybe, trying to figure out some complex topic?
Oh yeah, that feeling of just drowning in information.
Exactly. Total information overload. So today, we're doing a deep dive specifically for you, cutting through that noise.
And we're tackling a really important development in AI, specifically how we're trying to teach AI to, well, reason better.
Right. We're focusing on a research paper that introduces something called Reasoning Gym, RG for short.
Think of this as your shortcut, basically. We'll pull out the key stuff, the essential insights.
And honestly, some pretty surprising findings came out of it, too.
Definitely. So the paper starts by mentioning these big leaps we've seen recently in the reasoning abilities of large language models.
You mean like OpenAI O1, DeepSeek R1, those kinds of names you hear about?
Exactly those. And a key technique behind this progress is something called reinforcement learning with verifiable rewards, RLVR.
RLVR. Okay, so that sounds powerful, and I guess it must be, given the results.
It really is. But the paper hits you right away with a major problem.
Which is?
Data. To make RLVR work really well for complex reasoning, you need just a ton of high-quality training data.
Ah, and that's where the problem lies.
Precisely. They call it a scalability bottleneck. Getting that data is hard.
How come?
Well, right now, you either rely on humans creating it, which is super expensive and slow,
Okay.
or you try scraping stuff from the internet, which is, unreliable and not always accurate.
Right, you don't know what you're getting.
Yeah.
So neither of those really scales up for the amount of data needed.
Not sustainably, no.
Yeah.
And this data scarcity is seriously holding back progress in making these models better reasoners.
So enter the big idea from this paper, Reasoning Gym.
Exactly. And the kind of revolutionary part is procedural generation.
Okay, what does that mean in practice, procedural generation?
It means instead of having a fixed set of questions, like a traditional data set, RG is like this library of environments that can generate new problems, new reasoning tasks on the fly, potentially like an infinite amount.
Infinite training data.
Virtually infinite, yeah. And crucially, the answers are verifiable.
Meaning?
Meaning the system can automatically check if the AI's answer is correct or not. No need for a human to look at every single one during training.
Wow, okay.
No.
That automatic checking sounds like the key to actually scaling this RLVR thing.
It's a huge part of it. The paper lays out a few core design ideas for RG.
Like what?
Well, first is that algorithmic verifiability we just mentioned.
Yeah.
Tasks where correctness can be checked automatically.
Got it. So it's not just about sounding plausible, it has to be actually right.
Exactly. Then large solution spaces. The problems aren't simple fill-in-the-blanks.
More complex.
Yeah, they're designed so the AI has to learn general strategies, not just memorize specific answers to specific questions it saw before.
Okay. Promoting real learning, not just memorization.
Right. And the third one is parametric difficulty control.
Meaning you can dial the difficulty up or down.
Precisely. You can adjust how hard the generated problems are.
So let's connect that back. How does this whole RG set up the procedural generation, the verifiable answers, actually solve that data bottleneck problem for you, the listener, trying to understand AI progress?
Okay, so it tackles it in a few ways. One, because every problem can be unique, the model can't just memorize the training set.
That seems vital.
It really is. Two, it allows for what they call dynamic curriculum learning.
Curriculum learning, like in school.
Sort of. You start the AI with easier problems, and as it gets better, you automatically give it harder ones. A gradual ramp up.
Makes sense. Easier to learn that way.
Three, it provides that, well, effectively unlimited stream of training data that RLVR needs to work well on complex tasks.
Solves the scarcity issue.
And finally, maybe most importantly for researchers trying to understand how AI learns.
Yeah.
It gives really precise control. You can tweak just one aspect of a problem, make only that part harder, and see how the model responds. Isolate specific skills.
Like a controlled experiment for AI reasoning. So what kinds of reasoning tasks are actually in this reasoning gym? Over 100, you said.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive. They group them into domains that kind of mirror how we think about problems.
Like?
Well, you've got mathematical domains, algebra, arithmetic, geometry, the usual suspects.
Okay, but infinite variations of those thanks to procedural generation.
Exactly. Then there's algorithmic thinking, things like search problems, optimization tasks, following procedures.
Right.
Logical reasoning is in there too, formal proofs, applying rules of inference.
Logic puzzles, almost.
Some are, yeah.
Well,
Then pattern recognition, finding patterns in sequences, or even visual analogies described only using text.
visual stuff described in text. That sounds tricky.
It is. And finally, constraint satisfaction problems, which includes games, puzzles, planning tasks.
And you mentioned these aren't just static lists of questions. They're like little algorithms themselves, with knobs you can turn.
That's a great way to put it. They have parameters. Difficulty parameters let you change things like, say, how big a maze is or how complex an equation is.
Okay.
Structural parameters change fundamental things like maybe the number of dimensions in a geometry problem. And even stylistic parameters changing how it's worded, like variable names, without making it harder or easier, just different.
So you can test if the model is just latching onto superficial wording.
Exactly. That fine-grained control is really powerful for digging into what the model actually understands.
Can you give us a couple of concrete examples to see the range?
Sure. So in the games category, they have a Rubik's Cube task.
A Rubik's Cube, seriously?
Yeah. The model has to output the sequence of moves like URRF prime, using the standard Singmaster notation.
Wow, okay, that's complex spatial reasoning.
It is. And right next to it, there's a rush hour task.
The parking lot puzzle.
That's the one. Get the red car out. The model needs to output the sequence of moves for the cars. Again, specific format needed.
So, planning and spatial stuff again. What about that visual in text category, cognition?
One example there is Figler fonts. Remember those words made of ASCII art?
Oh yeah, like banners people used to print.
Exactly. The model has to read the word from the ASCII art, which is given as text input.
That's wild. It has to see the shape from the characters.
It really tests that translation between representations. Another one is binary matrix, find the distance from each cell to the nearest zero cell. Again, spatial, but purely text-based.
And logic.
They have things like circuit logic. You get a text description of a logic circuit diagram and the inputs.
Annotate gates or gates.
Yep. And the model has to calculate the final output.
Okay, classic symbolic reasoning.
And algorithmic includes things like spiral matrix, printing out the elements of a matrix in a specific spiral order.
So it really covers a huge range. Symbolic math, text-based visual puzzles, logic, following procedures.
Exactly. All generated on demand, all verifiable.
Okay, so they built this incredible gym. What happened when they actually put the current top AI models through their paces? What did the experiments show?
This is where it gets really interesting. First, they just tested the models straight out of the box. Zero-shot performance, they call it.
So no special training on RG tasks beforehand.
None at all. And maybe not surprisingly, even the best frontier models really struggled with a lot of these RG tasks. Especially those tasks trying to represent visual or spatial ideas using only text. The ARC, cognition, and games categories, Figure 1 in the paper shows this pretty clearly.
And was there a difference between models?
Oh, absolutely. A very clear hierarchy. Models that were already specifically trained or optimized for reasoning.
Like the O3 Mini or DeepSeek R1 you mentioned?
Exactly. They did much, much better than really strong general-purpose models like Llama 4 Maverick or Claude 3.5 Sonnet.
Yeah, not better.
The paper notes a, quote, striking 22% gap between the best reasoning-focused models and the best non-reasoning ones.
Wow, 22%. That really suggests that this kind of specialized reasoning training, like RLVR, unlocks something fundamentally different.
It seems to. It's not just about being generally smart. It's about having these specific reasoning capabilities fine-tuned.
But even those top reasoning models weren't perfect, right? Especially in the spatial stuff.
Yeah, far from it. They mentioned that even the best models scored less than 50% on those text-based spatial reasoning tasks in the cognition and games domains. That's clearly a major hurdle still.
Okay, so baseline performance is tough. What else did they find? You mentioned something surprising.
Yes. This is what they called the difficulty cliff.
The cliff. Sounds ominous.
It kind of is. What they found was when they took a task, the model could do reasonably well in an easy configuration. And just cranked up the difficulty slightly, made the puzzle bigger, the equation more complex.
Yeah.
Performance just plummeted sharply, consistently across different models and different types of tasks.
Like fell off a cliff?
Figuratively, yeah. But Figure 3b shows these dramatic drops. For one model, O3 Mini, performance on some code tasks dropped by over 70% just by making them a bit harder.
70%?
Yeah. And big drops in other areas too, over 33% in graphs and geometry, over 25% in algorithms. DeepSeek R1 showed similar steep falls.
What does that mean, though? Does it suggest the reasoning isn't very robust?
That's one possible interpretation the researchers offer. Maybe the models are learning strategies that work for simple cases, perhaps based on patterns or templates.
But those strategies just break down when the problem gets genuinely more complex. They don't generalize upwards.
It could be something like that. It suggests the reasoning might be shallower than we sometimes assume. And again, it really highlights how hard text-based spatial reasoning is when scaled up.
Okay, that's a sobering finding. But you also mentioned exciting news about skills transferring.
Yes, this was, for me, one of the most exciting parts. Skill transfer and generalization.
What did they find there?
First, they saw strong intra-domain transfer. That means within the same category.
So training on some math problems helps with other math problems.
Exactly. They'd train a model on, say, half the algebra tasks in RG, and then test it on the other half it hadn't seen. And performance jumped significantly.
How much?
Table 1 shows the details. For algebra, it was an plus 11.7% improvement on the held-out tasks, even in the games category, where the models started at basically 0.
Yeah, you said they struggled there.
Right. But after training on some game tasks, they actually achieved a measurable 3.3% accuracy on new game tasks. It shows the training is teaching domain-specific skills.
Okay, transfer within a domain. That makes a certain amount of sense. You practice algebra, you get better at algebra.
Right. But here's the kicker. They also observed significant cross-domain transfer.
Cross-domain, meaning?
Training in one area, like algorithms, improved performance in a completely different area, like algebra or geometry.
Wait, really? Training on algorithms helped with geometry. How?
I know, it sounds weird, right? But Table 2 lays it out. Algorithmic training gave a huge plus 29.1% boost to algebra and plus 22.3% to geometry.
That's massive.
It is. And logic training helped with cognition tasks, plus 13.3%, and graph problems, plus 9.1%.
What of the games? Did training on Rubik's Cubes help elsewhere?
Get this. Even though the models barely learned to solve the games themselves, that training still led to big jumps in algebra, plus 21.8%, and cognition, plus 13.1%.
Hold on. So struggling through trying to solve a virtual Rubik's Cube actually made the AI better at abstract algebra.
According to their results, yes, it's pretty mind-bending.
What does that imply? That it's learning some underlying general reasoning muscle.
That's what it strongly suggests. The RLVR training on these diverse RG tasks seems to be developing more fundamental, transferable reasoning abilities, not just task-specific tricks.
Okay, that is surprising and pretty cool. Did this transfer hold up outside of the RG environment, like on standard tests?
Yes, they checked that too. External benchmarks. Table 3 shows the results.
And
They trained models on RG math tasks, then tested them on standard math benchmarks like GSM8K and the harder math dataset, and they saw improvements there too.
real-world validation.
Exactly. One model, Gwen 2.53b Instruct, got a nearly 10% boost on the math benchmark after training on RG math problems. So the skills learned in the gym definitely transfer out.
That's really compelling evidence. And one last experimental piece. The curriculum learning.
Right, curriculum RLVR. They tested if the order of training mattered.
Easy stuff first, then harder.
Yeah, versus just mixing all difficulties together from the start. They used a task called spell backward.
Okay.
And the gradual curriculum, easy to hard, led to faster learning and better final accuracy. Figure 6 shows that clearly.
So starting simple and building up works better, even for AI in this kind of environment.
It seems so. Structure helps.
This sounds incredibly promising overall, but I assume it's not perfect. Did the researchers talk about limitations or where this goes next?
Oh yeah, they were quite upfront about that. Limitations in future work.
Such as?
Well, and some really complex areas, especially ones needing like genuine creativity or lots of real-world background knowledge. Those are still hard to generate procedurally in a meaningful way.
Okay, so it can't generate everything yet.
Not easily, no. And also, while having automatically verifiable answers is great for scaling the training,
Yeah.
it might not capture all the subtleties of what makes a solution truly elegant or insightful from a human perspective. Sometimes how you solve it matters, not just if you get the right number.
Right, so there's still a place for human judgment or feedback.
Definitely. Things like reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, are still important for that fine-tuning and alignment.
And RG is mostly text-based now.
Yes, currently focused on single-turn, text-in, text-out reasoning. Future work could definitely expand to multi-turn conversations or multimodal reasoning, involving images, maybe sound, alongside text.
Makes sense.
Oh.
And any other big research questions RG opens up?
They mention things like studying learning in more realistic scenarios where data isn't always perfectly clean or presented nicely, like continual learning.
Where the AI has to keep learning without forgetting old stuff.
Exactly. How to prevent that catastrophic forgetting when training on new RG domains is a big open question this platform could help explore.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. For you, our listener, wanting to stay on top of AI developments, what's the big takeaway here? What does Reasoning Gym really mean?
I think the big picture is that Reasoning Gym represents a really significant step in building the infrastructure needed to train more advanced AI reasoning.
It's like building a better gym for the AI athletes.
Kind of, yeah. A scalable, controllable environment where we can push models harder and, just as importantly, actually study how they learn to reason. It's a powerful playground.
And the results are telling. The zero-shot struggles show where the current gaps are, especially that text-to-spatial reasoning problem.
Right. And that difficulty cliff finding is crucial. It warns us that maybe some of the current reasoning skills are more brittle than they appear.
But then there's that cross-domain transfer.
Which is incredibly exciting. It offers this tantalizing hint that maybe we can train AI to develop more general transferable intelligence, that learning to solve puzzles could genuinely make it better at math, or logic training could improve spatial sense.
It suggests something fundamental is being learned.
Potentially, yes. This deep dive really shows how creating these structured, verifiable environments might be a key to unlocking reasoning skills that work across wildly different kinds of problems.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a really interesting question to chew on, doesn't it?
Definitely.
If training an AI in this gym on things like virtual Rubik's Cubes or rush-hour puzzles makes it quantifiably better at abstract math, like algebra or geometry, what does that imply about intelligence itself?
Both artificial and maybe even human intelligence.
Yeah. Could mastering diverse abstract challenges, even seemingly unrelated ones, be a fundamental pathway to building broader, more general problem-solving capabilities? What other unexpected connections might be waiting to be discovered through this kind of training?